Well, I'm here with Tawnie Olson, the composer of That's One Small Step, which will be performed by the Halifax Camerata Singers on November 16th. Tawnie, welcome. It's great to see you again. How have you been?
It's so great to see you too. And I'm so excited that you all are going to be giving the maritime premiere of this piece. It's fantastic and super great. So I'm doing really well, just composing away and living life. So yeah, it's all
That's
good.
awesome. I'll also just give a little pitch because we get to perform. I get to perform another of your works later this season, Urban Legend, with the Nova Scotia Youth Orchestra in April. I guess we'll have a few performances there. So anyway, I'm really just so grateful to be spending time with your music and to get to spend time with you today. I would love to just invite you to introduce yourself a bit. You're known by many in the Canadian art scene. We know about your operatic works, about your choral works. Certainly, give us an elevator pitch though, in case any of our audience members haven't met you yet.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm a Canadian composer and I'm currently based in Connecticut. And yeah, I've about half of my compositional output is instrumental and the other half is vocal. And the vocal part of it includes quite a lot of choral music for different kinds of ensembles and different combinations of chorus and instruments. And I do, in fact, have an opera, which Renaissance Opera and Vancouver Opera co-produced last November in Vancouver. It's called Sanctuary and Storm, and the libretto is by Halifax native Roberta Barker. And yeah, it was done again in Arizona in January as part of the National Opera Association conference. So that was a really big, exciting thing that happened in the recent years. I've also written a couple art songs, but yeah, most of my vocal output is choral, and that started in graduate school when I joined the Yale Camerata. It was terrifying because I had no choral experience and no singing experience, and I had to sing an audition. Well, I shouldn't say
Is
I
that
had
with
no.
Simon?
No, that was with Maggie
With
Brooks. That
Maggie?
was before Simon even
Yeah.
arrived. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I shouldn't say I had no choral experience. I sang in an unauditioned chorus in undergraduate, my undergraduate degree. But that's a really different thing than an audition course or singing audition. So I nearly died. I think I lost 10 years of my life going through the audition, but I survived and I got into the Camerata and I was asked to sing in the recital chorus. And so that was the beginning of a really long association, a 20-year association with the Yale Camerata that I sang in for 20 years. And Maggie programmed almost every choral piece I wrote. And so I really learned, I was in the thick of things learning to write for choral music because I'd write a piece and then I'd have to sing it. And I get the feedback from the choir in real time because they're sitting around me having to learn the piece, so I would be able to figure out really quickly like what works, what doesn't work, you know and so it's just a really invaluable experience for me.
So, what inspires you as a composer? I mean, that sounds like a really incredibly inspiring environment to be in when you're with artists like that. But what are some of your interests that really sort of spark your imagination? Is it like texts, is stories? Is it people? Is it yeah?
Well, I think like the first source of inspiration is somebody asks me for a piece. That's number one. Somebody says, could you write a piece for bassoon, or could you write a piece, I need a piece this length for this group. And so it starts with that, and sometimes the commissioner will have specific ideas for me to play with. I'm very firm about I'm generally very picky about text. So if the commissioner is really insistent on a text and I do not like the text, I will turn down the commission. And I generally make that clear up front. I'm like, it's not personal. I don't think I can, this is not the text for me. I need to have freedom, but I'm really happy to work within a theme. So, for example, That's One Small Step was commissioned by two community courses, both of whom had a lot of members who worked for NASA. And the commission was for 2019. And they said, could you write us something space themed? We were thinking chorus, maybe some instruments, but not keyboards, so that we could do it in different venues that aren't, might not have a piano. And, I'm so clueless. I was sitting there, I'm like, it's 2019, 50 years ago, it was 1969. I wonder what was going on in the world of space. 1960. Oh, the moon landing.
Woodstock. Oh
Only the
no.
moon landing. So it seemed pretty obvious to me that I needed to write a piece about the moon landing. So in that case, the inspiration was they wanted a piece, they explained, and they gave a theme, and then the it really was like, here it comes from the sky. Like this is really what I had to do. Like I felt like I couldn't do anything else but that. So that was one case where that was pretty obvious, and then it was just a matter of reading all kinds of. I mean, NASA has amazing images and audio files and text files all on their website. Like there's a lot of documentation around the space race, around the moon landing, different. So there was just a wealth of material for me to read, learn, investigate, and draw from. But so I know there's been other sources of inspiration. I did have one piece that was for the chamber choir of the Il Camerata, and Maggie Brooks approached me and said, chamber choir, 1 to 3 instruments, will be for an Advent concert. And it was for years away. And so I was like, oh, all right, sure. Da, 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 da. And then I get an email. Okay, I need the text by the end of the week. And I had like 3 other commissions to finish before I even started it. And I was like, what the what? And then it was like out of the blue, I just heard these very wintry, cold sounds. I heard a harp, and I had the feeling that this was going to be in a language that the audience didn't really understand, and it would be about winter, but not necessarily. I didn't really want to write a piece about death. And I thought a secular piece would be a good thing to do, in part because of some conversations I had with like a Jewish colleague who talked about how she didn't want to sing in Camerata because sometimes they sang Christian music and she didn't feel super comfortable with that. And I thought, it'd be good to have a secular piece. But of course I didn't have a text. And so I started searching and searching, and I went on Facebook and said, does anybody know a text about winter that's just about death? And they're all about death. All about death. And they're all, nobody. So there was nothing. And it was Friday morning. I still hadn't found anything. And I had to know by the end of the day. So I met my husband in downtown New Haven for lunch. And then we went over to a used bookstore, and I wandered over to the poetry section. And there was this book of Irish verse over the centuries. And I pulled it out and opened it up. And the first poem in it was this poem in medieval Irish. It's Skeilumdrof, which ended up being the title of my piece, because that was the poem. It was perfect. It's about winter coming. It's secular, although it was penned, I believe it was sort of like penned in the margins of some monastic book, but it's not, there's no religious component. It just describes the arrival of winter in these incredibly poetic, beautiful terms. And so, yeah, that was a case where the text sort of came very fortuitous, but like circuitous. It wasn't the first impulse. Usually the text is first, but in that case, it was like, I just had a vague idea and a sound, and then the text fell out of the sky.
Right. Amazing. Amazing. I'm just imagining like Britain walking into the bookstore in Halifax and finding, ceremony of carols.
Yeah, right.
Those
I mean, used
titles.
bookstores or bookstores that generally are great for that. You find things in a way, they just come off the shelf, and there you go.
That's amazing. So once the inspiration has struck, and you've got parameters, and maybe you've got a text if it's a sung work. Do you sit down at the piano? Are you a pianist? What sort of is the first sort of goal of sort of express? Do you sit down at the harp? I guess I don't know what. Yeah,
No, no, I spent a good hour meeting with a really amazing harpist who ended up playing in premiere, and who now lives. She's Canadian, as it happens, and she now lives in Newfoundland, and is sort of internet famous. She makes all these amazing videos of herself playing covers of pop tunes on electric harp. So
her name is
Kristen Touch.
Kristen. She's from Moncton, New Brunswick.
Yes, yes. So
Yes.
she explained to me very beautifully how to write for harp, and she is a phenomenal harpist. And so I wrote that harp part specifically for her, and the ISM actually paid for her to come down because she moved back to Canada. They paid for her to come down and play the premiere, which was really special and wonderful.
So she doesn't know me from Adam, and she doesn't know this, but I'm really hoping to actually hire her in 3 years.
Oh
So
yes,
now I have to find out about more about this piece specifically.
yes,
But yes, that's
absolutely hire her for anything, because she is just a harp goddess, and she's a
yeah,
lovely human being, and just
that's what
very,
I've heard.
really, really amazing. So anyway, you're asking about
That's
my
very cool.
process, and I have, because I'm in my office right now, I have like some sketches. What is this for? This is for my percussion quartet. This isn't anything vocal, but anyway, I'll just hold up a sheet of paper for.
I
So,
love sketches.
so I have like all of these. These are all percussion quartet sketches. Um, Basically, if it's instrumental, then I'm looking for basic ideas, then I'm developing basic ideas and trying out different things, playing them upside down, playing them backwards, putting them in another mode, or if they're rhythmic, changing the rhythm. Actually, even if it's not something for percussion of a definite pitch, the rhythm's still going to change. I play around a lot with rhythm. Um, but the very initial kernels of the choral pieces, I'll have the text and I will write a bunch of different settings of that text. And then I'll sleep on it and I'll come back and decide if I like any of them. And sometimes it takes a while, like the first phrase of my Magnificat took 10 tries before I found the right melody for that. So sometimes it's a lot. I can't remember how many tries it was for That's One Small Step, but I can tell you the first thing that I wrote was the melody of the second movement. Now it is time to take longer strides from Kennedy's speech. That was the absolute first thing. And so I found that melody and just thought, ooh, this is doing what I wanted to do. And so I actually, was starting on the second movement first of that piece, even though I knew that wasn't going to be the first movement of the piece.
Yeah.
That was where things got going.
So I have to ask you because I the second movement is so beautiful, and I love the architecture of your music. Are you a Trekkie?
Well, I mean, not really, but yeah, that was a very deliberate Star Trek slash Aaron Copland. It's like
Totally.
a mashup of Star Trek and Aaron Copland, that whole movement, because there's something about that American idealism
Absolutely.
base, and I couldn't resist. I know. I just
That's it's beautiful. It's not. I hesitate to ask a composer of like, oh, why does this sound like this, or why did you
Oh
like
no, no,
where
no,
we
no. It's
absorb
usually about
everything.
space. Like, you think I'm not gonna have some Star Trek reference in there? No, there's gonna be Star Trek. And also anytime there's anything that's sort of American and idealistic, everyone goes to Aaron Copland. We all go to a very particular part of Aaron Copland's oeuvre, and we're like, this symbolizes the purity of the American ideal. And I think so.
Yeah,
I think that you'll also hear like, oh yeah, there's some Copeland in there.
yeah.
There's some Star
That's
Trek.
it's
There's some Copeland, and
it's great.
that's all completely on purpose. And I almost feel a little guilty about it because it was really fun to write.
It's so compelling and so accessible, but also there's so much capacity in this work and in so much of your music that I know for like the complexity and sort of there's a there's like a heady quality which is like really fun to spend time in. And in this, I just think that I also will say I love when a musical score paints a picture for the performers. It's not something that the audience ever gets to, or rarely gets to kind of appreciate, but I do love the rhythmic element that even is embedded in, the reduction for the singers, but certainly with the full score. And it's just this wonderful sense of like of anticipation, of anxiety, and that, beneath this beautiful sort of broad, hopeful Americana sort of phrasing in the voices. It's so wonderful. So I
Yes,
guess
because Sputnik is beeping away, or the
exactly.
very first, it's going around the Earth, and everyone is freaking out, and so it's in a different. I've got a little polyrhythm or polymeter. I know scholars like to fight about, does polymeter exist? I don't want to have a fight with anyone, but it's not in the same rhythm and meter as the singers. It has its own thing that
Exactly.
is interrupting, and as you said, disrupting this sort of like otherwise sort of calm and hopeful ideal. It's like, but Sputnik, what are the
Yeah.
Soviets up to? What is that satellite doing? Is it
Yeah.
spying on us? What? people, it was just really freaky the first time for everyone. And I hadn't thought about that because, I was born after the moon landing. I grew up with the idea of spaceships and satellites. Like, when something happens before you're born, it's like your brain decides it's always been there. And you
Right.
don't think about what was it like the first time this happened. And so it was really interesting to just read about how nervous everyone was about that. And
Yeah.
how even though Kennedy is using these like beautifully crafted phrases that are all full of hope and idealism, but like underneath it all was the Cold War and this idea of like, do the Soviets have intercontinental ballistic missiles? If they can launch this, are they going to be able to hit us with nukes? We need to have, we need to develop technology because we might need to hit them back with nukes. And meanwhile, the regular people are like, but what if nobody hit it? Like, what if we didn't do that at all? Could we like
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
blow each other up?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just like there's a lot going on in the space race. And so thank you for I'm glad you enjoyed that because yeah, even in that moment, there's layers that sometimes right in the middle of that movement it comes to the surface where we have
Yeah.
Yuri Gagarin going into space and that kind of thing. But
Yeah, and we'll sort of navigate elsewhere in this work, of course. But I'm so glad you started with this movement and that this was the first steps kind of in the compositional process. So your 2018, your 2019, whatever whenever it is that you're writing this, how much is the threat of nuclear war looming in your mind in present day, and does that sort of seem to have a resonance in this work as well. Like this is, obviously we have conflict in formerly held Ukrainian territory. We have so much that has come from the Trump term that brought so many thought to be dormant kind of anxieties, back to the fore. So how much of that, if any, is sort of a part of this or a part of your thought process?
yeah, it's kind of disturbing that my piece has become more relevant since it was written. That's not a good thing. I'm not happy about that, but it's true. I was writing it during the Trump presidency, and we didn't know if it would be a two-term. We still don't know if it'll be a two-term. There'll be another term. But and yeah, because of some of his rashness in terms of geopolitical negotiations, it did suddenly seem like perhaps North Korea or somewhere like that might be sending missiles. And now that there's this terrible ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin does not seem to have a very high regard for human life. Um, it is something that suddenly has become a concern, and it's sort of sad to me because I grew up, with during in the 80s. I was a kid and learned about nuclear missiles in like grade 5 or 6 and was scared out of my mind. And so that was sort of hanging over us. And then, in the 90s, the Berlin Wall came down and we thought, oh, great, this is all over. We can live our lives and be happy. And it seems like somehow we've come back into a world where the people who remember World War II are mostly gone. The people who remember Hiroshima are mostly gone. And there are just enough powerful people out there who do not value human life that it does become something that's a concern, I think, for most people. But yeah, there has been conflict since Putin became, for years, Putin is not a big fan of the West. And so that conflict has been going on, but it does seem to have intensified a lot um, in recent years.
And of course,
And do you
this
think that,
the space race, and also the sort of the race for just um,
well,
the
yeah,
capacity of sort of nuclear nuclear arsenals
yeah,
spread well beyond
yep.
the Cold
And
War,
it
well
was
beyond
a
Russia.
propaganda coup as well, because,
Yeah.
there were a lot of countries that were not necessarily aligned with Russia, the Soviet Union. They weren't necessarily as aligned with the United States. And I think there was a conception of um, whichever country can sort of progress the farthest in space and show off their technological prowess can make a case for the fact that maybe they're going to win the Cold War, maybe you should side with them. Maybe they'll have more to offer you. So there was a big sort of geopolitical propaganda component. Um, and I think that's going on today. There's so many challenges to democracy around the world where there are have been democracies. Its democracy has been eroded in many cases. And there are other places like Poland, which in the most recent election sort of pushed back against those erosions of democracy. And there's some hopeful signs there. But it does seem like things that we thought we could rely on that had been sort of resolved and settled are no longer resolved and settled, and some old conflicts have arisen once again between a more authoritarian way of governing and a democratic way of governing.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's in the piece and it's in our world right now for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly 2019 is very recent, but this feels like it's absolutely, it's very, very timely. The outer movements in this work certainly sort of capture that, the essence of the moment that the whole world was, undoubtedly watching and listening to. And so can you talk a bit about some of the musical motives? You've talked about kind of polyrhythm, polymeter. I think some of that is at play here as well.
Oh, yes, especially in the
And
first movement. Holy moly. So much polyrhythm, so much
singers
count.
love that, by the way. There's
Yeah, and the bass drum is like the hero of the first movement. And the
yeah,
bass drum just starts out with these very spaced out soft hits that then over the course of the movement, the distance between them shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks until finally you have the rocket launch and the bass drum player actually gets to play a dynamic that most percussionists like to play, which is very, which seems appropriate because the rocket, very loud.
yeah. Yeah,
So
and earplugs might be needed to be distributed.
yes,
Um,
anyone singing near the bass drum should definitely just surreptitiously.
Exactly, exactly. So, as this sort of time lapse is happening, did you map that out like mathematically, like in a particular way, or how
Well,
does
I
that
think the
how does one do
changes
that?
happen. The changes happen according to a pretty regular pattern. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think it goes from like 8 beats to 6 beats to 4 beats to three to like 1.5 to one, and then it's the roll.
Yeah, yeah,
But where it changes is more intuitive and connected to what's going on harmonically and in terms of the text. So the when we have a new section, the bass drum changes the pattern and makes it again the space between the hits gets smaller every time we have a new section.
awesome.
So
Um, Yeah. Anything else that you want to share with us about, like, as you were no doubt doing research, going down these YouTube rabbit holes as I've been doing, or whatever else was happening? Like, how did these musical motives kind of emerge and connect to the story?
yeah, well, I mean, the first movement, I was so fascinated to learn like you don't actually have to have a countdown for a rocket launch. Like they didn't need to do that. It was just done for theatrics. Like when Yuri Gagarin took up, he just said, "Bayekali, like I'm ready. Let's go." That's all he did. There was no 10, 9, 8. That
Right,
was all theater. It was
right.
all theater, and it was part of like Americans love their theater. And so I that was just seemed like an opening for music for me and for me to be theatrical musically. And play with just the countdown that happens in the first movement. I think there was also I saw while I was writing this piece, I went to New York to see the premiere of Julia Wolf's piece "Fire in My Mouth," which was written for the New York Phil and the sopranos and altos of the Crossing and the girls of the New York City Youth Choir, I believe it is, which is that is a huge evening length dramatic piece. It's one of the I think it's one of the great pieces for chorus and orchestra ever, but certainly of this century, it's going to be one of the important ones. And she's really big on repeating words and polyrhythms. And so I think this sort of like 30, 30, 30, 30 seconds, that sort of like that is like very, I think Julia Wolf got in my ear there.
I
Um,
I love that. I mean, we were singing David Lang last year, and there's an element of like when the text is broken up in that way, it is so captivating because even when you know what's happening, you can trick yourself into being like, wait, but what? What's the next like
Yes.
what's the next
What's the
thing? And
next
it's
word? When
like
is it coming?
and when is it coming? Because it's more tantalizing because it's being
Hmm.
repeated like that. No, that's it's so affecting. I also just want to ask about like how do you build these wonderful misterioso chords that we have like at the end of the first movement? Is it just like I don't know, how do you find
Ah,
the color that particular
yeah. I'm trying
palette?
to remember. It was pretty intuitive, I think. I think I sat at the keyboard. I have like, because I live in an apartment building, I have, let's see, this little electronic keyboard with headphones. And I really do, in general, prefer pianos, but I also prefer not being evicted or driving people crazy. So, and one of the advantages of the electric thing is it doesn't only make piano sounds; it can make sustained sounds. So there's like a really objectively terrible string sound, but it has a sustain and it's soft, and I can get something that's a little closer to the timbre of a human voice than a piano, even if it's not the same. And so I can try out chords with that and sort of hear what they sound like when they're sustained. So some of it was that, some of it was, believe it or not, I was trying to be kind, somewhat kind to the singers in terms of voice leading, which you probably won't believe because there's some big leaps. Um, but I also feel that because it's such a cluster, like I think if I'd, it would have been much harder if I'd written C major triad, frankly,
Hmm.
because after the explosion of the bass drum and all of the time that elapses
Yeah.
while the rocket gets into space, I think people would lose their sense of it would be hard to hold on to a clear enough sense of pitch to emerge with an in tune C major triad after
Yeah.
that, or C major, or any major triad in tune precisely would be hard. And with a
Yeah.
cluster, I'm not recommending people sing the wrong notes. I'm not saying sing out of tune, but like it's a cluster.
Yeah.
So it's gonna sound great, kind of whatever happens, but like shh, don't tell the
Yeah, no.
it will sound better if you sing what I wrote. But if something happens, it should still be effective. It should still work. So
We will. I promise. The sort of the last movement, which sort of begins with that and works sort of in reverse order. Again, it's just I mean we don't have to spend time on this except this is what conductors love to do and kind of to dissect these amazing things. I just love the sort of the shading, the care you take with dynamic gradation, and I wonder about you wrote this for like the first performance was how many in the chorus?
I would say 50 or 60. It was a pretty
Yeah,
big course. And I
not
mean,
huge, not like a
no, not like 120 people.
yeah,
No, it
yeah,
was, I'd asked the conductors how much to be Z and what are the ranges of each section. And, you know, so I
yeah,
was working within very carefully within what they had given me when I wrote,
yeah,
when I wrote those more complex scores. But no,
yeah.
they did. The interesting thing was that I did not realize that not everyone in the first course that sang the piece could read music. And I
Oh,
did
yeah,
not write a piece that I thought was I would not have thought that piece was singable by people who can't read music. But Sarah Pruitt Gallo, by some wizardry, got them to learn and sing that piece, and they loved it, and they
yeah.
sang it beautifully. They sang the daylights out of it. But yeah, there's a lot of dynamic shading in the midst of that complex chord that, yeah, would not have written
Yeah.
had I known, but nobody told me that. So I just wrote, and then they learned it. And I tried sending sketches to the conductors. It just happened that they were both super busy and none of them got back to me about whether anything was practical. So I just kept writing. And then I was
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
here's the bees. But they made it
That's
work and they did great jobs.
awesome. Absolutely. Sarah Fergallo and I were fellows together many years ago at a summer institute, so it was really neat to just have that
Oh,
connection with this work
oh
as well.
great.
Yeah, and the reason I ask is because it really when I initially programmed it, I thought this might be a challenge for a 30 voice ensemble to kind of try to get at the same core of this, you know, if it's intended for a large larger work, but it's written well. It's written in a way that's very that's really accessible even for a group our size. I think certainly dependent on then sort of the venue that you're in really helps, etc. And but I hope we do it justice. The
Oh, I'm sure
the
you'll do a fantastic job. I'm not concerned.
Well, we are loving this piece. Like, and really, I often get so excited about a work that I just feel like I really admire a composer's work, and perhaps I'm too close, and I just like, then you have to kind of feel like, oh, I have to like pitch this to the choir. Like, you want them to love it as much as you do. And I didn't even bother doing that, like I forgot or something. I don't know. Like there's no need whatsoever. The choir immediately fell in love with it, and they were like, "This is so accessible." And the Trekkies were like geeking out, and people are just like so loving it. So what I think is so beautiful is the way that you have been able to sort of encompass different moods through this, multi-movement work. So the third movement, with the pairing of the Russian Orthodox text and the Requiem text, and then the spoken names, or the chanted names, it's so affecting, and it's more compact than I think maybe a lesser composer would have made it. But how did you like? Was that just sort of like an obvious place to go with this, or how did you land on this sort of memorial?
Well, I was fascinated by the sort of the little statuette that was dedicated to lost astronauts that was left on the moon that was missing the names of two Russian cosmonauts because the Soviets had covered up their deaths in their space program. Um, I just thought that was a poignant and interesting thing. And I have a friend who attends and is a member of a Russian Orthodox church and is very devout Orthodox Christian. And so I was talking to her about the piece, and I asked her, about the, Russian, service for the dead. And she sent me a huge long thing and included this hymn. And I went and listened to YouTube. There's some really great Russian choruses singing Vechnaya Pamyat on YouTube. And so I ended up just not only quoting the text, but the whole hymn. That's the hymn in there. And even though at the time it was the Soviet Union, so like the Russian Orthodox Church existed, but they were doing the rest to grind it out of existence. And certainly not all the astronauts who died were Catholic or Russian Orthodox. Lots of people with atheists and all kinds of other faiths who unfortunately have passed in connection with the space program. But I thought, again, this idea of these two opposing forces matching, sort of beating up against each other, combining with the very human desire, both for the memory of the one who has gone to last forever and for that person to be okay. Like I think when you say requiem aeternam, like we sometimes forget, oh, that means eternal rest. Like you're actually hoping that they're okay in eternity. I think those are just really basic human desire and impulses, whatever our beliefs might be. And yet, in this case, they're sort of bumping up against each other. These two different cultures and these two different ways of trying to deal with the same problem of grief.
So beautiful. And obviously, in a choral context, in our Western canonic tradition, the Requiem is just so symbolic of like some of the greatest works of, their choral orchestral repertoire. So it's really always like a self-indulgent kind of thing for a choral singer to sing these texts, sort of irregardless perhaps of personal, faith association, because we do also associate that with that humanity of like singing collectively, and that sort of like
Mm-hmm.
just that the way those chords just like move move in your body. It's a really human experience. So our November program with the Halifax Camerata Singers is titled Inhale, and we have Exhale coming in May. The idea with Inhale is that we are singing music that I think takes your breath away, and also it gives the idea of being on a precipice or having a bold aspiration, something that you're going to have to kind of like gear up for, and then decide, am I gonna take the plunge? that's what we hope the audience sort of takes on board. Obviously, your music embodies this idea. This is such a bold story, and it's such an aspirational tone, like through the whole work. Are you often drawn to subject matter that tells big stories like this one?
Um, Honestly, I think I will engage. I like to engage big ideas, but sometimes through the lens of individual people and emotions. I did not. Obviously, Roberta wrote a brilliant libretto for my opera. It has only three characters: Eleanor of Aquitaine, Hildegard of Bingen, and Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. But it engages with really huge ideas about vocation, about how do you respond, how do you deal with tyranny or with oppression, and with the idea of like what happens when two people come together who actually fundamentally do value the same things, but they are so different that at first they just react like oil and water and they just absolutely can't understand each other. How do they find understanding? How do they develop a shared vocabulary, work towards a shared goal? So it's a really big idea, but it's in a very tiny context of these two women talking to each other and the angel of history sort of coming in and out and intervening from time to time. So it's that intersection. And yeah, I think I do, I wrote a piece called Beloved of the Sky. It's a 5 movement a cappella choral piece that sets text from Emily Carr's journals. And it's not really about Emily Carr, it's about the creative process and celebrating the creative process. And it's, I used Emily Carr's words because I was writing for 3 American choirs. It was a consortium commission, and no one in the States knows who Emily Carr is practically. So I was like, you're going to have some Canadian culture. Um, but at the same time, within Canada, I think people will argue about her legacy and how much she was embedded in destructive beliefs of her time, yada, yada, yada. But most people agree she could really paint and she could really write. And so often the creative process is being delivered through a male lens, and in a and so I really wanted to like talk about this like thing that's both men and women, people of all genders create and experience the creative process. What does that sound like or look like if it's seen through the female lens, a woman lens? So there was it's a big idea, but it's just these little sentences from one person's journal, and that connect to these huge themes that I think we all relate to, because everybody's creative. If somebody says they're not creative, they don't realize all the creative things they did just to get through their day.
That's beautiful. I love, and that's definitely represented in this work as well. That idea of a really like monumental event, these huge ideas, and you talk about sort of the theatrics. When Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon, they had no idea how they were going to do that. So there's just that like incredible yeah, boldness, but then you drill down and you see the human experience, but and the human, the toll in this work. But it's really beautiful. I ask this each time I interview a composer: what do you want audiences to come away with after hearing That's One Small Step?
Oh my goodness. Well, maybe if they're my age or younger and they haven't really thought about the space program, or they haven't thought about the moon landing because it's one of those things that has always happened because it happened before you were born, maybe just have a moment to reflect on this incredible achievement. And when you leave the church or the theater, look up at the moon and think, people walked on that. People walked on it. That's insane. People were there. More than once, several times, several people were there, which is bananas. And I have to admit that, I would look out the window as I was composing, and, the moon would often be right out my window. And I would just think, huh, because I really, I just hadn't spent that much time. So I think just thinking about the amazing things that we can do, motivated by ideals, unfortunately also motivated by fear, and maybe I don't know if it'll give them any new perspective on the ongoing conflicts, but hopefully just a little bit of a sense of hope and inspiration and a reminder that people can come together and do extraordinary things that don't seem possible until suddenly they happen.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I hear you are writing something right now for one of the great Canadian choirs, the Electra Women's Choir. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're in the middle of?
Oh, well, I haven't started writing notes yet. I'm in the text searching process, which has been consuming every brain cell and more for me for the last couple of weeks because I've been thinking about it for months, but it finally I had to settle down and get the text. And so I've been thinking about this. This is going to be Morna Edmondson's last concert as director of Electra. And so I was thinking about change and transformation, and I encountered the work of a 17th century woman named Maria Sibylla Merian. She was German, and she was raised by a painter in an environment in which women could, in fact, be involved in printmaking. They could paint watercolors, not oils, but they could do a lot of observation and painting. And she was obsessed with insects of every kind, but especially caterpillars, and very beautifully and carefully documenting their life cycle from eggs through chrysalis to butterfly, back to eggs, and what they ate, how they interacted with their natural environment, and things that people at the time, most people at that time still thought that bugs spontaneously generated. And at the very beginning of her first caterpillar book, she's like, no, caterpillars come from eggs, which to us seems very obvious. Again, it's like the moon landing. You don't realize that was actually a really big, bold thing to say. And then throughout the book, she shows all of them together with the plant on the page. So she's kind of looking at the full ecological picture before the word ecology existed. In ways that, there were people before her who had observed, oh yeah, they seem to lay eggs, and then that, but nobody had done it with the accuracy and detail that she'd done. Nobody had really before her done the same kind of work in a thoughtful and kind of scientific way, presenting insects deliberately with their food and describing in the description of the insect, and this is what it eats, this is how it behaves, this is what happened. She describes, she didn't know what they were, but she described, at that point, she figured it out later, but she describes things like parasitoid wasps. So she would say, sometimes out of the cocoon, there's no butterfly, there's these little yellow flies that come out. And other naturalists are going to have to figure that. She did the further studies are needed, the 17th century version of that, because she was just like, this is happening. But
Hey,
then,
you're in.
yeah, by 1705, though, she traveled to South America, to Suriname with her daughter. She funded it herself by selling her paintings. And she was so fascinated because she'd seen samples of the insects and animals from Suriname that had come to Amsterdam, where she was living at the time. So she went there, and because she wanted to see all these things for herself. And while she was there, she figured out these are parasitoids, because of course those were also happening in South America. So she was a really brilliant, unusual person who was really respected in her time. Her contributions were very valued for about 50 years after her death. And then in the 19th century, there was a systematic attempt to discredit her, partly out of sexism, partly out of scientists wanting to separate themselves from amateurs, because of course she hadn't gone to a university. She wasn't officially a philosopher. She had just done all this observation study on her own. So therefore, and she was a woman, which also, So, and she'd observed things in Suriname that nobody thought could be real, like ants making bridges of their bodies, which obviously can't happen, except it does. And spiders eating birds, which obviously could never happen, except that it does. So, she was sort of buried and has only been recovered sort of starting in the mid 20th century onwards. People have been recovering her scholarship and realizing, especially the work that she was able to do in Europe, where she was for years and years raising caterpillars and butterflies and moths in her own home and observing them, just the accuracy of her observations as well as the beauty of the images she created. So I'm taking a very small text of hers, and my plan is to set it to music. But I didn't know anything about her before I started this project, and as you can tell, I'm obsessed. I want to write now. I want to write like a 20 movement piece using her
Your next
text.
opera
They're so
is
cool. Or
the
an opera, maybe
Caterpillar.
another opera, maybe an opera about her. She's really amazing. Everyone
Exactly.
should know about her. So that's what I'm working
That's
on
really
right now.
cool. That's really cool. I've just started watching Lessons in Chemistry. Did you know this?
Ooh, yes, I saw. I think I saw the first couple episodes of that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not deep into it yet, but I'm interested. I'm in the kitchen though. I'm not in the Amazon. Tawnie, thank you. It is really cool to spend time with you, and we are so excited to invite audiences to hear your music, other works premieres by other Canadian composers. We're featuring music of Marie-Claire Sandon, Benjamin Segerson, Edward Enman, and yeah, we're really excited. So November 16th, Inhale, presented by the Halifax Camerata Singers, featuring Tawnie Olson's amazing music. That's one small step. Tawnie, thanks for hanging out with me, and really look forward to sharing your music with the Halifax audience.
Well, thank you so much for programming my music. It's just such an honor to have you conduct it and have the camera to sing it. I'm really excited for this.
All right. Thanks so much.